Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this Standards Australia webinar on the circular economy as part of our centenary celebrations. As I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all meet. I'm meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people today in Canberra and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Reflecting on that video that we just watched of Standards Australia's last 100 years, we have left footprints behind in terms of public awareness, but we've also left footprints behind in terms of products and resources and waste that we want to do something different with through the circular economy. And I'm delighted this afternoon on behalf of Standards Australia to welcome Lisa McLean, the CEO of Circular Australia, one of the leading experts on the circular economy in Australia, a great supporter of the work that we are trying to do with you all in the circular economy to lead us in this discussion. So Lisa, thank you. You are very welcome.
Thank you so much, Adam. And I'm also coming from the traditional lands of the Wallamadigal people of the Eora Nation, so I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's terrific to see so many of you here joining us today for this really important discussion about transitioning Australia to a circular economy and the role of standards. This is part, of course, of the centenary celebrations of Standards Australia. And if we look back over the past 100 years, our economy, infrastructure, utilities, economic and business models have been dominated by linear approaches. So coal-fired power systems, landfills and incinerators, large dams, transport networks, and all dependent on fossil fuels. So these have served us very well for many decades, but they now come at an unsustainable carbon and resource cost. So this take, make, waste approach to resource consumption is really putting Earth's life systems under phenomenal pressure, and this is pressure that just can't be sustained. By 2050, there will be 10 billion people on the planet, so that's not enough virgin resources to continue to consume the way we consume today. So throwing away and flushing away our resources is accelerating the climate crisis and biodiversity loss and overuse of natural resources with deforestation, land degradation, waste and pollution, and of course carbon emissions, which in turn of course are causing devastating extreme weather events. Over the past 75 to 100 years, our legislation and regulations, policies and standards have been designed to support these linear approaches, linear business models and solutions. So today we've got a lot of change that we have to make to achieve a sustainable economy, sustainable growth, to drive new jobs and new industries and productivity, while also protecting natural capital and biodiversity and removing carbon from our economy. And the circular economy really is the only economic framework we have to make this critical transition to the future. And we're just going to put up a slide now to show you the definition of circular economy. There's a lot of definitions of circular economy. We use at Circular Australia the Ellen MacArthur Foundation definition, that circular economy is regenerative by design. It gradually decouples economic growth from the consumption of finite resource use, keeping those materials in the economy for as long as possible to extract more value from them. And if we look at the second slide here, defined by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the circular economy is based on three principles that are driven by design. So one is to eliminate waste and pollution. The second is to circulate products and materials at their highest value. And the third is to regenerate nature. And the first principle, to eliminate waste and pollution, this relies on us seeing waste as a resource, as a design fault, so that in fact we design out waste as we move into the future. And here you can see there are opportunities for regulatory and policy and legislative reform, but also new standards that provide specifications to ensure the materials re-enter the economy at the end of their use and they're not incinerated or landfilled. And this brings us to the next principle, which is circulate products and materials at their highest value. And if we look at the next slide, at Circular Australia, we do look at the 9 R's. The 9 R's of recycling start with refusing waste and materials and products that are unsafe or toxic and have no recycling or reuse value. And if we want to extract the real value from materials, if we want to encourage sustainable growth in our economy, we need to get down to the detail of these R's. So rethink, that's the designing better, reducing, of course, reusing, repairing, refurbishing, remanufacturing, repurposing, and then recycling and recovering. And we'll hear from Suzanne Tamburo about circular economy opportunities in that area shortly. The final principle of circular economy is regenerate nature. And by shifting away from the take, make, waste approach, we create more space for nature to thrive and also for biodiversity to thrive, ensuring access to nature for future generations and also for more regenerative food production and agriculture. The way we produce food today is a significant driver of both climate change and biodiversity loss. We're over-relying on synthetic fertilisers, pesticides, fossil fuels, fresh water and other finite resources. And of course, these are a source of pollution. Fertilisers and pesticides can stay in the natural ecosystem, damaging it and also human health. And we're going to hear from Helen Melissa shortly about circular economy in food production. The economic incentive and opportunity of circular economy is absolutely massive. It's estimated that Australia could generate almost $1.9 trillion, or more than 3% of GDP, in direct economic benefits over 20 years by making the circular transition. And we could also save a colossal amount of carbon emissions, around 165 million tonnes of CO2 by 2040. Of course, half the emissions that we need to cut to get to zero, our zero carbon targets, are embedded in food and products, and we need the circular economy to make sure that we're reducing those emissions. But $1.9 trillion is a pretty big incentive to change, to not be scared, to be bold and embrace new ways of doing things, new solutions and innovations that are more circular. And many of you and your organisations are already beginning to unlock this $1 trillion economic opportunity. So well done, and don't stop. To reap the benefits, as I'm sure you're finding out, means not just being competitive but also collaborative. We absolutely cannot achieve this transition on our own. Not one company, not one government, not Standards Australia. We need to work together. And we understand that design is critical to the circular economy transition. So what role can standards play here to ensure waste is designed out of materials and products and that they can go back into the economy at the end of their use? The establishment of new safe circular supply chains is also at the heart of the circular transition, taking resources bound for landfill or incineration and putting them back into the economy to extract more value. Think of your own businesses. Do you fully understand what's in your waste stream? What are the resources? What need to be designed out? What are the markets for those resources that can keep staying in the economy? And how can your business or organisation unlock benefits from new circular supply chains or new products, or a more meaningful participation in those reusing those waste streams? Circular Australia ran a Hospital Plastics Circular Supply Chain Alliance program last year, and I like to use this example because it demonstrates that the circular economy is a systems transition across all sectors. Here we partnered with St Vincent's, who collected used needle caps and ampules right in the middle of the COVID pandemic. They were collecting what many considered to be a dangerous waste stream, but high quality plastic. And thanks to the leadership of one particular nurse, they collected a whole lot of ampules and needle caps, and in collaboration with Circular Australia and a manufacturer in Western New South Wales, All Moulds Plastics, they then transported these plastic components out to Western New South Wales, to Orange, where the manufacturer turned them into roller door wheels for the built environment and wind farm components. And this process also prevented the use of virgin plastic pellets that were being imported. So we analysed the job creation opportunities and the savings, if scaled, and they were the equivalent to 40 new nurses and 10 new regional recycling and manufacturing jobs. So really substantial opportunities here to create meaningful new industries and jobs. And what was considered a waste from the health system was a phenomenal resource for the built environment and also the renewable energy sector. So circular economy is a systems transition across our entire economy, not just waste management, but mobility, energy, water, and the built environment. It's a resilient system. It's good for business, people, as well as the planet. And the role of Standards Australia is essential to a safe and successful circular economy transition. For example, certification for circular solutions that ensure the higher use of materials, more agile approaches to certification that achieve safe outcomes, and also how do we acknowledge performance of technologies of products that are potentially proven in other jurisdictions but not Australia? And how do we certify the right circular technologies? These are some of the questions and challenges, and we're going to hear some great examples coming shortly from our speakers on circular economy. But before we hear from them, please prepare your questions. Think about your own circular economy journeys, your barriers and opportunities. We want to hear from you, so please put your questions into the chat box and we'll endeavour to answer as many of those as we can. And with that, let's get started with our speakers, and then we can have the discussion on how standards can supercharge Australia's transition to the circular economy. But first, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Suzanne Tamburrell, CEO of Australian Council of Recycling. Suzanne is an organisation leader with deep experience in public affairs, executive management, stakeholder relations, governance, strategy of not-for-profits, with a strong reputation as a sustainability, recycling and circular economy subject matter expert. Prior to ACOR, Suzanne was the long-standing Executive Director of the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, ASBEC, where she delivered impactful policy outcomes for building sustainability, including advancing the energy performance provisions in Australia's building code and informing the priorities of COAG's Energy Council's trajectory for low energy buildings. Suzanne has broad experience encompassing federal and state governments, industry and not-profit organisations. She's passionate about leading positive change for people, industry and planet. And on that note, Suzanne, I'm going to hand over to you.
Lisa, thank you. And it is such a pleasure to be in this discussion, and also, I guess, really interesting to have come over from built environment sustainability policy and move to what I might consider to be the other side of the looking glass in terms of resource recovery and recycling, because there's such an interest in that part of the sector in sustainability and circularity. The challenge is figuring out how to get that done well and holistically. And having moved over to the other side, what my new perspective is, being in this role with ACOR for just over 12 months, is that at its heart, the circular economy is about embedding the questions of what happens next and what happens after that, and after that into our production processes, and ensuring that there are answers to these questions. And that requires a systems-wide approach where every part of that system has a role to play in delivering an outcome that supports the next part of the system. It requires manufacturers, producers and developers to think past the sale of their goods, past the use of their goods and past the disposal of their goods, all the way around to how these things can be recovered and then perpetually cycled back into the supply chain. And it's a really good time, actually. You know, having evolved through a heavily polluting industrial age, we've come a long way in sustainability, inventing renewable energy, becoming vastly more efficient with the energy we do use, and reducing the broader environmental impact of many industries. But what I've learnt from a recycling perspective is the concept of sustainability stops short of actual circularity, with a really big knowledge and infrastructure gap after the end of use of products and materials, at the point where our stuff reaches the end of our intended use and becomes so-called waste. And waste is a problem for someone else to solve, so we often put it in the recycling bin and pray for the best without really inquiring what happens next. And it's that gap in producer and consumer consciousness that for me is a really big missing piece in the circular economy, amongst others. And I look forward to hearing more from Helen on that too. But as a population, we're aware of the hazards and the undesirability of pollution. But are we aware properly of our individual and collective role in value creation through the recycling supply chain? Because as long as we think of products and materials that have reached their end of use as waste, then the priority is going to be to get it out of the way as fast and as cheaply as possible. Because after all, waste equals pollution and risk. And it's stringently regulated as such, which makes the recovery of resources from waste streams very expensive and riddled with red tape. Waste management is a service that we procure to make a problem go away, and we want it to go away quickly and easily. And whilst we often procure that service intending to support resource recovery, we mostly don't delve into the question of what happens next after our waste is collected. We have to remember, though, that the commercial drivers underpinning waste services aren't generally or necessarily geared towards genuine resource recovery. Their priorities are the same as everyone else's, getting rid of the stuff as cheaply and expediently as possible. After all, their bill has already been paid simply by picking it up. So I don't want to be cynical about waste collection because it's fundamental to the resource recovery and recycling process. I just want to point out it's an area that generally generates complacency when we can least afford it if we're committed to circular outcomes. To support proper resource recovery, our mentality needs to shift from waste management to value creation, and this is the role that we all play in this space, and this is the dialogue we all have to be part of. And if you can think, standing at your yellow bin at home, think about what happens next when you sort your recyclables into from your general waste. Think about the fact that non-recyclables in that bin are contamination. I've seen a staggeringly wide array of contamination at resource recovery facilities where people put things like televisions, nappies, power cords, batteries, gas cylinders and videotapes into recycling. And the optimistic term for this is wish cycling, putting something in the yellow bin and wishing it can be recycled. And perhaps it's because we aren't really thinking about what happens next. If we adopt a lens of value creation, that hopefully can imbue a different mentality and a different sense of responsibility. Because it's true, much of the waste we consider to be waste is very much recyclable, but only if it goes to the right place. And separating waste from recyclables at the source is going to be key. We do a lot of that really well, and there's a lot more of a journey to go on there. Think about batteries that should never be put in waste or recycling bins. They can explode, they can cause fires in trucks and most types of recycling facilities. But if you deposit them in the right place, and there are hundreds of collection points around the country, they're delivered to specialised battery recycling facilities which extract valuable minerals and sell them back into markets. A circular approach. If you think bigger into the construction sector where there's a huge opportunity for recovered materials. However, if the construction waste isn't properly sorted, it can be contaminated with things like asbestos, and that would render thousands of tonnes potentially useless and landfill. So there's a strong role to be played by everyone in that kind of connecting up those parts of the circular economy and closing that part of the loop, which doesn't even go to the much bigger picture that Lisa has illustrated in terms of design. But every piece matters, and this piece really matters. There's a fundamental focus, for example, of value creation at the beginning of the supply chain, but it does drop off at a certain point, and then it just becomes waste management. And the important thing is to retain this focus all the way through, being mindful of what happens next and creating value out of our products and materials at end of use in a scaled and systemic way. Of course, goods must be assembled in the right way so they can be repaired and reused, and you can follow all the other 9 R's of the priorities of a circular economy. But ultimately, when it comes to recycling, they also have to be recovered before they can be recycled, and recovery can only happen when everyone plays their role. Businesses and consumers play their role in contributing to further value creation. having said that, whilst I do firmly believe that everyone has a role to play in a circular economy, I don't want to underplay the role of producers. We heap a whole lot of responsibility onto consumers in a market economy, expecting them to drive sustainable outcomes by choosing wisely, asking them to read the fine print and probably pay a bit more to ensure that the stuff they buy has a lower environmental impact and can be recycled. But here also, greenwash, frankly, can be a big problem with misleading claims of sustainability and recyclability that don't deliver the results that we've actually invested in. And this actually then culminates in a bottleneck at end of use, where we end up with masses of material that can't be recovered, can't be recycled. So it's really critical all the way through to think about how we can support verification and ultimately, from a recycling perspective, implement mandatory thresholds for recycled and recyclable content, a fundamental role there for standards. But embedding that context of what happens next and what happens after that in a standards context for products, material and processes is one key way of ensuring that value can continue to be created after the conventional end-of-use phase, and it underpins the delivery of a collective vision for a circular economy.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Great presentation, lots of important points that we need to move past that perception that waste is a problem for others to solve. How can we support verification to ensure value continues to be created? Keep your questions coming in, but next we're actually just going to hear from our next speaker, which is Helen Millisa. She is the Director of One Planet Consulting. Helen's focus is on strategic changes that set our course for a sustainable future. She's been at the forefront of changes in water, energy, carbon, organics, materials, recycling and environment in government, private sector and several national industry associations. And for this, Helen is currently lead consultant to the Australian Government on a significant project into strategic changes to enable a circular economy for all products made, imported and used in Australia. She's also currently consulting on a world-first national stewardship scheme for soft plastics with the Australian Food and Grocery Council, standards for heavyweight shopping bags, and founder of Australia's first training program combining climate and circularity with the University of Technology, Sydney. Helen is also co-founder of Climate Wise Associations Australia, chair of Winston Churchill Trust Selection Panel for Industry, and member of the inaugural Tasmanian Government Board for Waste and Resource Recovery. Helen sees the challenges before us. She is enthusiastic about our opportunities as we reorient our organisational, financial and regulatory systems, moving away from perpetuating the linear and high-polluting past towards a circular, sustainable, climate resilient future. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much to Standards Australia. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. I'm here on Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, and I pay my respects to their leaders past, present and future. One of the key reasons why I'm delighted to be here today is because the anniversary of Standards Australia signing up to the global program is virtually the same year that my family arrived here as refugees from war-torn Europe. And my father is a manufacturer and designer of aircraft. I've lived in and around manufacturing and standards all my life. I'm not an engineer by training, but yet I've worked in and around the space here in Australia, and I'm a very ardent and passionate Australian for us to be a strong economy with a strong manufacturing base here too. So one of the things that I've been very pleased to do is be able to turn my attention to how we move to a more strategically sustainable economy in this country. And so that really is, I guess, a couple of slides that I'll present for you to explain that. So hopefully the technology will work. Let's see. Yes, fantastic. So we've enjoyed fruits of the world and the planet for a very long time, but now we're in this critical phase. And this diagram shows to you, as Lisa was describing earlier, the astronomical increase that we have put into our environment, into our atmosphere and our oceans of carbon and related gases. I won't go into all the carbon related gases. If you want to know more, I can explain that to you at great length. But we have a significant challenge, and this is basically that business as usual is no longer an option. We have to turn around the tables on many materials and production systems, on our water processing, on our energy systems. We're already starting to do that, but we have to absolutely accelerate that change. And we need to do that fast. So when we think of how long it has taken us to get to this point in time, we need to rapidly not only decarbonise but remove the embodied energy from materials through and products through reusing them substantially. So in order to cut our emissions by 50% by 2030, we need to basically cut our emissions by 5% each year, year on year, for the next 7.5 years. Each of us individually and collectively in our businesses and our workplaces. So here is another example for you of where we are with not just carbon and related emissions, but also with resource constraints on our planet. We are only one planet. There's no other planet. Although we've got a mission to Mars, the Moon, and maybe to Mars, we have to live within the constraints of this one planet here. And the reality is that we've been able to feed the growing billions of people on the back of both natural and artificial fertilizer production. But as you can see here from the wonderful resource of phosphate, we're running out. Now, we don't have 50 years to turn this ship around. We have to do it really quickly. And thankfully, there are water authorities and some scientists around the world that are giving some thought to how we do this. I know there are projects here in Victoria where our water authorities are looking at this, but this comes to the heart of the standards that we apply and how we're going to rejig our whole systems in order to capture this. In a way, I think that this isn't the third revolution, industrial revolution. It's not even the fourth, which is AI and the Internet of Everything and robotics. This is now the fifth revolution that we need, industrial revolution, to have a sustainable economy going forward, a circular one. So moving back to the diagram that Lisa showed before from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which so beautifully expresses both the material of the regenerative materials such as phosphate production and organics. There's also the non-renewable resources which we mine, that we extract and we make into goods. So I'm sitting here looking you at on a computer. The glass screen on my computer is made of glass. I'm not sure if you're aware, but we're also running out of fine sands to make glass. We're running out of hardwoods. We're running out of an extraordinary number of materials. And because of our economy and the way it's been established, and we fine-tuned it to the nth degree, the prices that we pay don't actually reflect either the environmental costs or the scarcity costs of the materials that we're putting into the economy. That is the challenge that we face within moving to a circular economy, is actually to reframe the systems in order to show true cost and in order to bring the various parts of the diagram together. One of the other reasons why I like this diagram, because to my mind I liken it to rather like a pinball machine. And if we have our linear economy where the material starts at the top and flows through the economy and then falls out the bottom to landfill, we are just not playing a pinball machine particularly well at all. And that's pretty much the way we are, particularly here in Australia, with high consumption and very low reuses, very low recovery back into the system. The material is flowing out the end to landfill. What we want to do is be a really good pinball player and have the material and the products circulating for a really long life, for repair, for reuse, and finally for recycling, for it to go back into the system again. I'll give you another quick example, and that is with a project, as Lisa mentioned, that I am working on with the Australian Food and Grocery Council. This is a complete rethink of how we are approaching soft plastics in Australia. Soft plastics which may be your bubble wrap or your chip packer or, for your chocolate bar, for the dry cleaning clothing, pallet wrap, all those sorts of products which currently are minimally recovered. We are establishing a complete new supply chain for the recovery of that material. It's an astronomical task, and we are bringing all the parties together very successfully because we're fundamentally cleaning up a supply chain and getting quality material back into quality material with all those parties in collaboration for it to go back into food quality grade plastics. Now, the challenges you can appreciate in terms of this, similar to the phosphate example, similar to other kinds of examples, is that we need to start at all the parties together need to be involved in this conversation, whether they're the manufacturers, the brand owners who are determining the design of that packaging, right through to the consumer, the council, and so forth. So it's a significant opportunity for us to move quality material away from landfill. Again, that pinball analogy. Another fine piece of thinking, though, however, is about the systems change that we need, and Lisa touched on that, as did Suzanne. And when I was in Europe for my Churchill Scholarship in 2018, I came across magnificent work which was being undertaken by Material Economics, same time as the European Union was redesigning their whole thinking around circular economy, and circular economy for plastics in particular, because it doesn't conform to normal economic instruments. And that recognised that for us to move to a low emissions future, we needed to move to a circular future. And we won't be able to do that within the current parameters that we have for our economy, for the way in which we finance things, for the rules and the targets that we have, for the policies and the strategies that we have. We need to change all of that. Likewise, if you can see from this diagram, it sets out all those different points in the supply chain, and they've measured and mapped where they do or don't move and provide for circularity. In each of those steps, there is maybe a certification, there may be a standard or several standards, there are labels, there are agreements that are established and contracts. All of those need to be refashioned and reassessed to move to a more circular system. I was able to take this piece of work and apply it here to Australia, and so hopefully soon, if Tanya Plibersek, Minister for the Environment, approves it, we will be releasing a report that I've prepared in conjunction with RMIT and Arcadis, which will build upon this work. This piece that you can see in front of you was something I fashioned in 2018 after my Churchill Scholarship, and a version like this will be coming out hopefully very soon. But I thought to share this with you because it shows and illustrates to you how at different points in the supply chain, for all of you listening on the Zoom call, how you can play your part in bringing about the change that we need. So whatever your part is, whether it's in terms of raw materials or what we call secondary raw materials, whether it's in terms of procurement in your business or in other businesses, whether it's as a consultant and an advisor to others, whether it's in terms of product design and having recycled content in it, whether it's determining the lifespan of a product, what labelling you go for in order to show that you have a circular product that can be repaired. All of these are measures that we need to bring into play that we haven't sufficiently done with to date. So I will perhaps end there, given the interests of time, and end on a high note, which is to say that it is within all our capacity to bring about the changes that we need. We have to restructure our economy, restructure our society in the way it works, and look after the environment, because we're going to run out, or we're going to pollute the environment to such an extent that we won't be able to feed, drink, and have the air that we breathe. So I wish you all the very best in your enterprises, wherever you are, and understanding that time is of the essence. If we can achieve so much within the next 7 years, we will place Australia in a strong position that we're all entitled to and deserve. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Helen. Well said, and of course, great points on the urgency of the circular economy transition, that stark reality, that figure that each of us in our organisation needs to cut carbon emissions by 5% year on year is really drags us into reality. So thank you for that. We're going to get to your questions shortly, everybody. First, I'd like Suzanne and Helen to come together. We're going to have a conversation now about how we do supercharge the circular economy. And firstly, I'd like to ask you both, Circular economy has been a relatively new concept in Australia. It emerged in force over the past 2 years because of the China sword, but then COVID, which impacted pretty much on every supply chain. Then we've had the geopolitics that's impacted trading partners. We've got wars and now potential wars emerging. A lot of this plays into the policy agenda of our new government, federal government, the Albanese government, which is looking at Made in Australia. And I want to ask you all, just to get an understanding, how important is, or ask you both rather, how important is the transition to a circular economy for your own organisations, but also your members and clients? And how are you encouraging and getting across that sense of urgency and need to act within your organisations and those projects and collaborations? Suzanne, can I ask that of you first?
Yes, of course. And Lisa, I love that question. Thank you. I think, from a recycling perspective, circular is foundational. The very kind of essence of recycling is about diverting material that might otherwise go to waste and remaking it and putting it back in the supply chain. But the drivers to deliver that, as you've mentioned, have only really kicked in a proper way over the last few years, and there's been a culmination of events that have helped to kick that in. As you've mentioned, export international markets for what otherwise might have been considered waste export, and geopolitical issues as well. But underpinning all of that is the real appetite locally for local manufacturing, for local jobs, and for sovereignty, really. And so it's really about time that we got on board. I think we abandoned our manufacturing sectors back in the 90s as the tariffs were dropped, and it's time to reconsider what that really means for us as a country. So let's just take kind of circular out of it for a minute. This is good for Australia, full stop, to be able to consider how it's going to make and remake our resources, whether they be recovered or natural. And so there's a much bigger economic opportunity outside of circular. When you apply the circular lens, then we're looking at doing something that's not only good for the economy, it's good for the environment and people as well. So there are so many wins to be delivered there. And from a recycling sector perspective, so many opportunities too. The waste export bans, which I have to admit are a bit of a misnomer. The fact is that up until a few years ago, Australia was largely, from a curbside collection perspective anyway, bailing up recyclable materials and exporting them to countries that actually had the infrastructure to recycle. We've made the decision to deliver higher value recycled outputs to overseas countries, and therefore we brought infrastructure onshore. And so it's really great to see the government coupling those export bans with a recycling modernisation fund, which has delivered unprecedented investment into onshore production. A really great thing for Australia, and again in terms of our sovereignty. So to answer your question, it's foundational from a recycling perspective, and also these recent circumstances have been transformational. Hopefully we'll see that catalysed into, as Helen identified, into that necessary systems-wide step change, because that can only be delivered across the whole of the sector and a whole of the supply chain. But from our sector's perspective, now's the time. It's a really great time.
Thanks, Suzanne. Excellent. Helen, how are you sort of encouraging those outcomes, and what's that level of understanding and sense of urgency?
Thanks it is a great question indeed, Lisa. I think that in my work, I alert people to the fact that to some extent we've been very fortunate and complacent in Australia. The global hunt for resources and capture and procurement of them has been going for some time. The fact that we are a resource-rich, very large country has shielded us from what's been going on for a decade at least overseas. I was astonished when I travelled in 2018 to learn that the Europeans and the Chinese identified quite some years ago that the current trade in waste was not sustainable and agreed to bring about a change. They were attempting to bring about a more circular economy in Europe and likewise in China, because for them their sovereignty and their economic goals are for strength and for unity within their economic trading blocks, and for them it suited them for China to bring about the China sword. They had been in negotiations for that for quite some time. So while it came as a shock to us, it actually is part of a bigger geopolitical economic framework that those economic blocs have been working to for a long time, perhaps a decade or more. So when I explain that to people and say that time for complacency is over, if we want to have and continue to enjoy the standard of life that we have here in Australia, we must actually wake up to this. We have a number of natural resources to our advantage. They include obviously significant natural minerals resources and so forth, but we also have something that not many other developed economies have, and that is a couple of complete supply chains. So we have an oil and gas and plastics complete supply chain and a pharmaceutical supply chain in this country. We manufacture those. It's so important for us, and we learnt that through COVID, to protect that. And I hope that the federal government and state governments will see that it's vital to ensure that those remain here in order for us to have a sustainable economy going forward and the standard of life that we enjoy. But at the same time, as we shift to a more renewable energy superpower, we will also have something that others will want, which is green power in abundance. And no other country, not in Japan nor Korea and others, have it, and yet they want it, and that is a challenge for them. So it is quite feasible, and we should be aspiring to actually build our economic and manufacturing base in this country based around the land, the resources that we have, in order to bring those sorts of businesses here to these shores. It's entirely feasible for us to do that if we have the will and the way to do so.
I like that definition, superpower. It's great to hear it, and you're absolutely right. There's huge opportunities there. We're going to actually flip it and go to an audience question because they're coming in quickly now. We've got a few queuing up here. So, Geka, we hear a lot about the critical nature of collaboration for a thriving circular economy. How do we move away from ego-driven silo strategies of potentially big players and towards genuinely collaborative modes of working to grow a circular economy at all levels? Who wants to take that one, Helen or Suzanne?
Well, can I have a go? Good question, and the fact is that it is already happening. Those collaborations are already forming. Probably not big enough, not transformative enough yet, but the wheels are in motion, and the question is, how do we deliver more out of them? I mean, one collaboration that, for example, GECA and Standards Australia are part of is the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, where over 30 peak bodies band together to identify their common priorities as they relate to sustainability and then deliver them in an advocacy context. Another one is, well, actually the work that Helen's identified through the Food and Grocery Council in mapping out a plastics plan. That is essentially, that needs to be a deeply collaborative exercise across the supply chain with willing partners thinking about how they innovate and move forward together. And so I guess to begin with, you have to start somewhere and work with the partners who are willing. We often hear the term coalition of the willing, and it's absolutely relevant in this case too. You move with who's willing to move, and the others will join as you arrive at a critical mass and pace. And we've seen some really good initiatives in that space already. But Helen, you might want to talk more about that too.
Oh, I need to add, because in the interest of time, so we get through more questions, and to say, yes, absolutely, work with the willing. If necessary, sometimes it's appropriate to kind of politely shame people. If you're going to have a workshop and you invite the willing ones to speak and the others are silent, there may be various ways around it, but I certainly appreciate the difficulties of that, and that's why it's so important to work as we are with governments, state and local, and keeping the federal government informed, so that we're leaving very little wriggle room for those that aren't interested in participating to not do so in the future.
Thanks, Helen. Another question here from Justin F. Does the panel think it would be both helpful and feasible for every global standard going forward, regardless of sectors, etc., to include a considered section on its circular economy implications and what relevant regenerative best practice elements should be adopted? I like the sound of that. You're nodding, Helen. Do you want to take that one?
Indeed, and I can't preempt what we've written into the federal government's report and recommendations on this particular topic, but absolutely, there are considerable measures underway overseas. So, for example, in Denmark, the consumer ombudsman there is now requiring life cycle assessments for any greenwashing claims. We're going to have to move to something similar to that, I believe, here in Australia, and I've written on that topic already, because I do believe that we're going to be swamped otherwise, and who knows what's going to be true or false. So there are certainly a lot of those sorts of measures. We're going to see, for example, the terms of reference of a whole wide range of organisations will change, whether it's the Productivity Commission, whether it's all sorts of entities, they move to that. One of the projects that I'm involved with, which is Climate-Wise Associations, we are advocating that all associations have within their policies, their programs, their targets, their award programs and so forth, recognition of climate change, for example. So we're going to see an overlay coming across, and that's one of the reasons why I was so excited to be involved today, is because I recognise that all the people on the call today have that capacity and that responsibility wherever they may be, through their professional organisations, through their work, through their training or advocacy or client work, in that capacity to start to bring those overlays in and think strategically about how they not only do a trial, but how they actually embed it as practice.
Thank you, Helen.
Could I add to that?
Oh, yeah, sure. Go.
I think, as Helen's mentioned, embedding those principles across all areas of practice in standards. We saw a really nice example recently with the Institute of Architects had as a threshold parameter for awards identified sustainability parameters before you can enter into any other category. So using that as kind of the threshold, and I totally agree, there is absolutely a space for standards to consider how that might form a threshold as well.
Great question.
Thank you. And I'm going to bring together two questions. One's from Yasmin Brinsmead. If I was a business owner, where could I discover how my waste could be reused? Pause, and let's add in Narendthural's question, which is, does circular economy mean making the same thing from a used product? Example, making a new pen from a used waste pen. Suzanne, do you want to try that one, or Helen?
I can try. With the first one, we're not asking everybody to do all the jobs themselves. Part of this, we talk about procurement of recycled materials. We also need to more thoughtfully procure waste management services as well. Some do it better than others, and just basically, asking as you are procuring those services to take away your unwanted materials. Really thoughtfully interrogating what that contract is. What are they promising you? Where's that that material going? Because often you can contract waste and recycling services. I guess and particularly from a small business perspective, you need to make sure that this is affordable and achievable. Just making sure that there is real clarity about where that's going next and and who their service providers are, because often they might just be a logistics company that's taking that material somewhere else. So I'd say ask more questions, ask to see more evidence about where this material is going. That's a really good start, particularly for those who don't have massive teams who can do very thorough due diligence. The first step is to just to ask what next, and can I see the evidence, please? But Helen, I'll hand over to you for the next question in terms of a higher value closed loop recycling.
I guess, and there was a repair conference or summit just 2 weeks ago held in Canberra, which has been looking at the whole issue of longevity of product and how we bring about repair, and we need to move to that fairly significantly. So the clothing that we buy, is it repairable? Is it multi-material? The same again with all sorts of others. So while we can focus on packaging, which is what fundamentally goes in the yellow bin, there's all the other products, the carpet, the flooring, the windows, the way we refurbish our buildings, which is absolutely critical. So at every step in the way, in all of those products, a decision is made for selection for long life or short life, for repair, for reuse, and so forth. So if in all of those decisions that we make as individuals in our businesses and so on, we can aim for longevity, better standards, repairability, those 9 R's that Lisa provided from the outset, then we truly are going to be providing for a more sustainable and enriched community and society as well. It will mean more jobs as well, because we're actually going to be recirculating more in the economy rather than importing and sending it to landfill, which is such a linear and wasteful system. So I hope that kind of combines the answers to the 2 questions in one.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic. I want to thank the panel and thank all of you for your questions. There's still some terrific questions which we'll take on notice and come back to you on. One particularly about the role of citizens, which is a really big one, and unfortunately we've run out of time to unpack that now. So please join me in thanking Helen and Suzanne, and I also want to thank you for participating today and understanding the importance of circular economy. I urge you to stay in touch and stay engaged on the circular economy, or if you haven't already, please start that journey. You can also reach out to the speakers separately, and of course Standards Australia, they'll be sending you some correspondence to all of you. There'll be information on how you can connect with them and support this transition to a circular economy. So on that note, I'd now like to hand back to you, Adam, and say a big thank you to Standards Australia.
Well, thank you, Lisa, Helen and Suzanne, for such a rich conversation this afternoon. And I've been reflecting, as you've all been speaking, on the opportunities that exist there for standards to really make a difference. And Helen, your point about standards, I think, was the one that resonated with me in terms of the catalogue that we have. We don't need more standards for circular economy everywhere. We need to use the ones that we have. We need to change them. We need to work with all of you to make things better. And as we reflect on our 100th year, we're not spending all of the time looking back, we're very much looking forward, and I think the circular economy will be a big part of that for us. So to our amazing panel and moderator, thank you so much. To everyone online, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again very soon. Thanks so much.